Brunenburg, 27th of October 937. A man staggered forward and fell into the mud. Beside him, another knelt, nursing his head in his hands. Around them, though a victory for Aethelestan, though a defeat for the Northern Alliance, men, covered in muck and filth and mud, rain running over bodies that were not joining in the dying screams, as if the heavens wanted to wash away the shame of the day. Finnenbeek, some way off, was also kneeling, fending off sporadic lunges from Saxons, before scooping up the older man, his brother of sorts, before sinking back down in the mud, cradling Selarch Mac Constantine Ui Alpin, 88,888,888. Osrith was standing still, as the battlefield emptied of life. On the horizon, illuminated by the setting sun, square sails were retreating. A man staggered towards Osrith, his battle mind upon him, tore towards her, his axe raised, his feet bogged down in the mud. She didn't see him, lost as she was in her thoughts, fatigue on her limbs, pain in her shoulder. It was beginning to ache now. Osrith did not see when someone dispatched him, for she was making her way, wearily, for the man on the floor beside him, not too far away. She glanced the face of Selarch, Constantine's and Mary's son. She had not been able to save him as she had saved his father. She looked back to Domhnall, then spoke to her son, who looked up to Osrith, his arm shaking from the effort of holding a shield. Where is ... Constantine? He ... He has fled, Mather, with Anlaf. They have ... gone. Osrith knelt to her son and squeezed at his shoulder, tapping it in a vague way of someone who felt they had to take charge despite being in shock. Domhnall was not crying out in pain as he lay dying. His banner, carried in heart, carried in spirit, once adorning the stone which Domhnall had brought from Tara, part of the Lear failed to sit on the boundary between Dulriatu and Pitland, bore no hint of white on the cloth now, as her fingers clutched the flag as those on the flag clasped the cross of Christ. But she did not go to her dour husband immediately. There was someone else who she needed to be beside first. 88,888,888. I knew you could not resist. Finan stood over her as she knelt beside Domhnall. Osrith began to cry. Even after everything he knew she had been through, Finan had never known her to cry. She knelt beside Uhtred, whose eyes did not look as if they were looking at her or anyone. You are not the brother I wanted you to be, Osrith began, pushing Finan away as she held his face, but you are my brother, my big brother, who I saw outside Bibbenberg, who swore to take it back. Uhtred closed his eyes, and then opened them, looking to Finan, then back to Osrith. His breathing seemed to have steadied, even though it was steadily slower. So you fought? I fought, Osrith confirmed. Am I dying? You've recovered from worse, Finan replied, when Osrith said nothing. This, he glanced to the stomach wound, is nothing but a scratch. He moved so Osrith would not see. It was death, it could be nothing else. Anlaf is gone, Osrith told him, Constantine too, and Selarch. The facts were coming out evenly, stoically, though her eyes could not contain the tears that were reforming behind her eyes. Selarch, he repeated, and Osrith wondered whether her brother was remembering the time he had taken the boy as hostage to the surety of Constantine not invading Northumbria, or Bibbenberg lands. At least he had kept that promise, Osrith told herself. And Ildub? Uhtred asked. And this time, Osrith said nothing. Finan took her hand. He fled with Anlaf, she said eventually, then knelt back, watching Finan's eyes as he saw the stub of arrows sticking out of her shoulder, resisting the urge to dig out more. Uhtred looked angry, not just the battle anger, but the look of angry disappointment that he always saved for her. Did you get what you wanted, sister? Will Constantine take Bernicia to the wall as Aethelstan takes the rest? I fought beside you, in case you didn't notice. Osrith shot back, with familiar venom. I sent your son from the field and took his place. I fought for Bibbenberg. That is not what I wanted, Uhtred told her, scathingly. And what I wanted was my brother, who came with the head of the man who murdered his adoptive parents, to fight that day and take back your fortress. I wanted to be free of Elfric, not to have to flee for my life. But she did not move, she could not. He was her brother, and she his sister, whether he wanted that or not. I am a disappointment to you. It was nothing more than a statement of fact, no emotion, no plea for empathy. But still, Uhtred persisted, you want Constantine to have to the wall. No. This time Osrith shouted the rebuttal, and might have tried to attack him in her protest, had she not been injured, had he not been dying on the field of battle. I want what you want, an independent Northumbria, free of Alba and Mercia and Wessex. If Anlaf returns with a plan for a kingdom of Jorvik again, I will support him as claimant. There was a pause. Finan held himself stiff, as if resisting with all his might to rush at Osrith or at Uhtred. Little chance, Uhtred breathed. Aethelstan is still a young man, and he is followed by brothers and cousins. Yet one day in centuries to come, Alfred's line will only be continued when a king of the Scoti takes both thrones. Where that had come from, Osrith did not know. But, as she said the words, she felt the Morrigan leave her, for the last time. Uhtred tried to laugh. The Scoti. You backed the wrong horse with the Scoti. He turned his head and fixed his eyes on Finan. And you with the Danes. Osrith retorted, feeling the battle emptiness be replaced with sorrow. Yet we will all live on this island. Our descendants will be pushing and shoving one another until time ends. I believe you are right. And then Osrith felt tears come to her eyes again, and she flung her arms around Uhtred. Not Finan, nor young Uhtred, who had crossed the field, his own burden to share, could, or even tried to stop her. You are my brother, she sobbed into his chest, and I love you for being my brother, no matter who you are, or where. Slowly, very slowly, Osrith unpeeled herself from her brother, as two priests came to take Uhtred back to Seaster, she supposed. Others were being taken from the battlefield in stretchers, back to carts, struggling in the mud and the rain. Uhtred looked past Finan, then took someone, flung an arm over his shoulder, taking the injured man towards the Merce. Finan ran to young Finan and put two blood-stained hands to his face. I have a son, he declared. I have a son. The flag of the Aelch, of Ulster, was now trailing in the decay as the body of Domhnall mac Duineal was being carried away. Unlike Uhtred, he was still. And yet, would the priests have made such an effort with a man already dead? Stop! Osrith shouted. One of the priests slowed, and then the other. Osrith ran and seized his hand. He was alive. Her heart quickened when Domhnall's hand wrapped around hers. You saved my life, Osred, Domhnall told her, his still grey-blue eyes fixing on hers. His words breathed weightily and with effort, as if there were attacks on them. You, Osrith began, not knowing any that she could say, now, after all that had happened that day. Osred, I saw you fight. He broke off, blood appearing at the corners of his mouth. I turned my men from you. She made to shush him, but he waved his other hand towards her, not letting go of her hand with the other. You fought, like a sight. Like their Morrigan herself. It had begun, for them, when she had arrived in Doire, at the court of Malmuir, his mother, and Findliath, his father. He had loathed and despised her, scorned her, had been intrigued by her, and been her friend for the time ever after. And, for Domhnall and Osrith, it ended like this. Come to Irian, to Doire, he tried, blood pooling in his mouth and trickling down the side of his mouth. An internal injury, organ damage. Lungs, probably. There would be nothing that could be done for him. I will find you, Osrith promised. I will find Don Shada, and you. Osrith saw Domhnall glance at her face, and his features seemed younger, like the face she had once known. He then looked beyond Osrith and she turned, to see who Domhnall was looking at. His expression seeming to indicate that he knew the person, but it was from so long ago he could not place it. It was Finan. Osrith looked back to Domhnall. Where is this man's sword? Osrith demanded to know. She made a grab for one of the priests, who gave her a terrified look. She screwed up her face and made to lunge at the second, who gave a shrill little start. Where? Osrith shouted. No one answered. No one knew. She withdrew Bué, the blade she had won, all those years ago, from Domhnall's servant, at the fair at Dara. Osrith took the hilt then as Domhnall closed his eyes, speaking quickly in Gaelish, Anater at Anim, Gonafadanim. Behind her, Finan joined in. When the Lord's Prayer had been said, Osrith made to withdraw her hand, but found that, amongst only a few other things in her life, that it was one of the hardest things she had ever had to do. Then, when she was about an inch away, and the priests were about to lift him up again, Domhnall opened his eyes. Osrit, he breathed. I am sorry that, he looked at Finan, then back to Osrith. There, Ulaid Prince has loved ye, he breathed, since the first moment he saw you, in Doia. Longest of all of us. I give ye to him. And Osrith saw that young Finan was standing not far away, watching them. Osrith got to her feet and pushed against the mud, stumbling towards their son. Take him to Iona, she instructed him. He is a king of the Irian, he needs to be with his kin. From her jerkin and ignoring the pain in her shoulder, Osrith found some coins, which sparkled silver in the dimming light. She pushed them towards young Finan, aware that several other people were watching them, not least Edmund, the Etheling, and Eardred both a little further back than Athelistan, all watching with respect. I will take him. A voice came out of the rain. It was Malcolm. He turned to young Finan and spoke a few words to him. Ildub will take his brother Selark and I will take our cousin. He looked at Domhnall and then back to Osrith. They will be buried beside my father, and Constantine's eldest son. And Osrith remembered that a different Ildub lay at Iona, a boy, Edra's favourite, Constantine and Mary's firstborn. Young Finan turned to Malcolm and then bowed his head, then strode to Finan and took hand, put his lips to the back of it for a moment, before letting it go, a gesture she had once seen Domhnall give to Findliath. He then strode over to the stretcher that the priests were carrying and dismissed them to other people, taking up Domhnall. I kneel for the last time. But it was not to be. Not a truce or an amnesty, then, were the West Saxon princes and the Englaland king, for a circle closed Malcolm and young Finan's path. Edmund, Eardred, Athelistan, and his household warriors prevented them from moving any further. Osrith turned, and was astonished to see Uhtred on his feet. You have your victory, Athelistan, Uhtred continued, upright, and with his sword in his hand, his other clamped to his stomach. The Saxons will never leave these lands, and those surrounding the Saxon lands will never again attempt such a thing again. It was not a suggestion, it was a fact, deduced from the observable evidence of the day. Anlaf and Constantine had thrown all they had at Athelistan's Englaland and it had not been enough. Without a word, Athelistan stood aside, and allowed the future king of Alba to leave with his kin. And all Osrith wanted to do was to cry out for news of Edra, of Anlaf's wife, and of their children and adopted children, about their well-being and their safety, in the hope that Thyra, her mother, would hear her and be pleased that Osrith had done what she had for her daughter. For it was true, in her heart, Osrith knew that it was Northumbria, and Bibbenberg, for her, as it had always been. Finan of the Ulaid, Malcolm nodded, before he began to walk again. Uhtred of Bibbenberg, Osrith of Berwick. Then he looked to Osrith, glancing down to the body of Domhnall before looking back to her. You are welcome at Dunotter at any time, Osrith of Berwick, Malcolm told her. And with that, Malcolm Mac Domhnall Ui Alpin and Osrith and Finan's son turned and staggered away with the body of their kin, from their humiliating defeat. Finan took Osrith's shoulders for a moment. But whatever might have happened then did not, for Uhtred was standing before them, with two men under sword point. Osrith was too exhausted, too astonished to speak, for the men under threat were none other than Caltigar and Bean. You were supposed to take my sister back to Berwick, he told them, the blade close to the jugular of Bean. Why was she on the battlefield? But before Uhtred could reply, he turned to Osrith, and reached out a hand to her, saying to her suddenly, you look like her, like Jaitha. I am sorry what happened to her. And then, the Lord of Bibbenberg crumpled onto the ground, and the heavens opened once more. 88,888,888. And once you had given him his last rites to send him to heaven, see to it that he has a pagan funeral, as he saw your mother had. Osrith told young Uhtred. They were in Bishop Oswald's chambers, the lifeless body of her brother still and calm. They need to be together. Young Uhtred looked as if he was about to say something, when the door opened. Benedetta swept in, looking to no one but Uhtred. She knelt by his side, and resisted any attempt to get her to leave. When the priests came to take his armor from him and treat his wounds, the Italian woman insisted on preparing him herself. Finan, having carried Uhtred with young Uhtred, stood to one side, his eyes not leaving the body of his friend. Was she like Gisela? Young Uhtred asked Osrith, more because he didn't want to tell her what he could hardly believe herself. Gisela was brown-haired, thin. Benedetta is small, shapely. Osrith looked to her brother, feeling her words, though accurate, were woefully inadequate. He is still alive, Benedetta told Osrith, looking over her shoulder. 88,888,888. Her ship sailed west, carrying the body of Uhtred of Bibbenberg. Waves gently lapped at its sides. Osrith stood at the stern, feeling the Trinity's planks. He liked sailing, he liked the sea. It was Sihtric, a man of few words, who had come to stand by her. By contrast, by her former husband had barely looked at her since the battle. Sihtric took up her hand and he patted it, before returning to Elfburh and looking back at the ship. Osrith stood on the beach and watched Uhtred's funeral boat carried by the waves east, to where long ago their ancestor, Ida, of the Umkels had come. Setting foot on the very beach they now stood and claimed this rock and built his fort. He will be with Gisela now. Finan's words were low, level. Osrith glanced to him as he slipped his hand into hers. At least Uhtred never knew that Bishop Oswald, his firstborn son, with Gisela, had been slain. Bean and Kaltigar had tried to stop him, but could not. He had, according to her bearers, been the man who had stopped Osrith from being cut down. Time passed, indeterminate time. Trinity was soon far out to sea. But neither of them turned to go, watching the orange flames lick the timber and consume his body. His body, but not his heart. At the center of Bibbenberg, dug by all of them, Benedetta placed his heart, which she alone had carved from his body. It could have been any one of them, Finan, or Igil, or Sihtric. But it was right that it was this woman, whose love for Uhtred had been pure, had been genuine. She wanted nothing more than him. She had given him comfort, had been the person who held him when he was frightened, listened to him when he was joyful, tended him when he was wounded. You never found many people who were everything. Uhtred had found two. Clouds played across the sun until the light, grey-yellow, stretched behind them, as if the west, the traditional destination for the dead, was reaching over the British Isles to grasp at what it had been cheated of. The light shimmered in the far-off sea, like the sun at high summer, and it looked for all the world that Uhtred of Bibbenberg was headed straight towards it. When she could no longer see the boat, Osrith reached out and instinctively felt for Finan's hand. They stayed together, hand in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon just a little longer, until at last her fingers curled around his before, eventually, turning and striding the sand back to the fortress of Bibbenberg. 88,888,888. In the days to come, Osrith would discover more deaths in that great battle. Constantine had escaped, but many nobles had not. King Owain of the Strathclyde Cymric had been slaughtered in the field, and worse, his two sons, Eochaid and Dyfnwell, had been blinded. A rumor had spread, as did rumors spread in days after battles, that Constantine had done it in order to annex Strathclyde. He had appointed Ildube, young Finan, to act as king in his place, for the line had ended for the Henogled, at least through Owain. You were right, young Uhtred told her, one morning, as seabirds caaed in the highest points of Bibbenberg. Osrith drew her eyes from the lone figure, black hair blustering in a black cloud around her head. About what? Bernicia regaining Lothian to Dunedin. Osrith smiled at her nephew. It is not the defensive position I would have chosen, and Constantine left it vulnerable. More news had come in the last month. Malcolm was now king of Alba, for Constantine had abdicated to live a life of quiet reflection at Chaldes. Are you happy to come to see my son's coronation? I would not miss it. It would be at Glashku, Dumbarton Rock, with the whole of Dulriata to the north, the land of the Scoti, the Picts to the east and Northumbria to the south. Young Finan would be a caretaker, with the notion that the Strathclyde Cymric would succeed to Alba properly. At Scone, young Uhtred went on, and Osrith marvelled Domhnall. He was more of a genius than I gave him credit for. The ships were ready, and they were down at the Strand line sooner than Osrith expected. Saxons were sailing north to Alba again, this time, however, by invitation. "Race you to the next, oh!" she heard Elena cry, exclaiming at her defeat when young Uhtred got to the first boat before her. Osrith looked up. Lindisfarne was just before them. They would sail beyond it, past Berwick, where she and Finan had returned to live, and up into the mouth of the Forth. "Send me back to the Ullaid land when I die," Finan told Osrith, who could not have sat closer to her in the stern of the boat if he tried. "Go back with my body, fulfill your promise to Domhnall." "Truly?" Osrith turned and Finan caught her surprised look with a kiss on their lips. "Yes." Under Don Chada, Irian's Uineal had come to some agreement about the land, and the northern Uineals, at Doia, and the southern Uineals at Maich, Tara, had re-established as separate kingdoms again. Osrith looked to young Uhtred, captaining this boat, taking them north. He was alive, thanks to the no small part that Osrith had played. He favoured his father, being large-framed, his bright, blonde hair and beard blowing in the whipping sea breeze, as did Don Chada, resembling as his did his father, Flan Sinna. He had even taken on poor Gormleth after Neil Glunjub's death, strict, but king-hearted, like his father had been, and, like his father, had pursued the policy of zero tolerance against the Norse, to great effect. And Uhtred, what would he have thought? It had been a long time before Osrith had dared to bring up the subject of her brother, directly, by name. He would have thought us fine strategists. His blood sits on the throne of Strathclyde and one day, will sit on the throne of Alba. Osrith reached over and kissed Finan back on the lips. Young Uhtred owns Bernish's land to the Forth, an independent Northumbria who is rising. Though Edmund will soon crush down Bloodaches, even if he has got support of the Archbishop. Osrith stopped and let Finan put his arms around her. "I regret the time I missed with him." Besides, she leaned over and kissed Finan on the lips. "I may die before you." "Never." Osrith Lackland then Finan bent his head towards her, and said by her ear, "Never Edra of Bibbenberg." "Would he have come with us?" "He would have protested, would have slandered you, and gone out fighting, or got drunk, or found someone to hump." Finan nuzzled Osrith's neck. "Did I ever tell you about the time when Uhtred?" But Osrith wasn't listening. Before an Irish king Osrith had once knelt, promising her fealty to the line of Aetildilpin, from Domhnall, Constantine and whoever came after. And, who came after was her own son, Uhtred's blood, raised in the Gaelish royal family and who would receive oaths at the red stone at Scone so carefully placed there by Domhnall mac Corstin. While Uhtred's line continued at Bibbenberg up to the Forth, it continued, into Alba, and beyond, forever after. And when, in the years to come, Finan and Osrith stood beside one another, as Ildub, son of Constantine, was crowned king of Alba, when Northumbria had been claimed, twice by Eric Bloodaches, who Osrith had harboured at Berwick and had allowed an invasion to begin in her lands, only to be overthrown by Anlaf and Edra's son. Finan kissed her neck and asked, "Would you have liked to have been Queen of Cumbria?" "It's where Street Patrick came from," Osrith replied, "and my mother, of the Britons. People get on with life. I wouldn't be much of a queen. It is better off in Edra's hands." They watched young Finan, ahead of them, fed a sword in hand. "A kingdom for our son?" "He is a poet, a storyteller," Finan replied. "He will ride by me until I die, then find his path. He will tell you, and me and his cousins, and all of Bibbenberg, of Northumbria and this thing called Englaland." And he held out his hand, which Osrith took, as he rode southeast towards the Forth, towards the Tuide and past their own front door of Berwick, to give young Uhtred the news that his cousin was now the king of Alba. Back to Bibbenberg, to where it had all begun.